Florence didn't conquer Europe with armies. It bought access. And once you control access, you don't need a throne. You control the people who sit on it. Early 15th century Christendom is fractured. Two rival popes claim the seat of St. Peter. Each excommunicates the other. Each is backed by competing factions across Europe. The Church, the ultimate source of legitimacy, is no longer a single authority. It is a divided market, and in a divided market, influence becomes tradable. Giovanni di Medici de' Medici sees what the princes and generals miss. This crisis is not only religious, it is financial. If a banker can help decide who becomes the one true bridge to God, that banker doesn't just gain a client, he gains the Vatican's balance sheet. So Giovanni chooses a candidate built for chaos, Baldassare Cosa, a man with ruthless ambition, hardened by lawlessness, trained in canon law, and hungry for a crown that can be purchased. Cosa has the votes within reach. What he lacks is capital, and capital is what the Medici have. Money moves, promises are whispered, cardinals are bought. In 1410, Cosa emerges as Pope John XIII, another pope in an already broken system. The schism deepens, but for the Medici, it's a win that rewrites their future. Control of Vatican financial accounts and a permanent doorway into the richest institution in Europe. This is the first move of a long game, not conquest by force, but power by ledger. The Medici did not treat banking as a destination. They treated it as infrastructure. In early 15th century Italy, wealth alone was fragile. Fortunes rose and vanished with wars, plagues, and political reversals. Giovanni di Medici de' Medici understood this better than most. Money that could not convert into protection, access, or legitimacy was temporary. Capital had to be transformed, or it would eventually be taken. The Medici Bank was built with this principle at its core. It expanded carefully across Europe: Florence, Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, placing Medici agents inside the arteries of trade and papal finance. But unlike rival banking houses, the Medici avoided reckless speculation and flashy dominance. Stability mattered more than speed. Reputation mattered more than profit margins. Giovanni emphasized reliability. Depositors trusted the Medici because their money moved quietly, predictably, and safely. Rulers and church officials trusted them because discretion was guaranteed. This trust became the bank's true asset. Interest rates generated income, but trust generated leverage. Crucially, the Medici never confused cash flow with power. Banking profits were not reinvested solely to grow the bank. They were redirected outward into alliances, political cover, and institutional access. The Medici understood that capital left sitting in vaults invited envy. Capital embedded into systems invited dependence. While other Florentine families sought office first and wealth second, the Medici reversed the order. They accumulated capital without political titles, then used that capital to shape outcomes without appearing to rule. This invisibility reduced backlash and delayed resistance. The bank also provided optionality. In times of crisis, the Medici could finance wars without fighting them, influence elections without standing for them, and punish enemies by tightening credit rather than spilling blood. Capital became a non-violent weapon, one that left fewer traces and provoked fewer uprisings. By the time Giovanni turned his attention toward the Vatican, the foundation was already set. The Medici Bank had done its job. It had produced not just money, but credibility, reach, and insulation from risk. For the Medici, banking was never the crown. It was the scaffolding that allowed every other form of power to be built on top of it. To Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the papacy was not a sacred institution beyond reach. It was a leverage point. The Great Schism had fractured Christendom into competing authorities. Multiple popes claimed legitimacy, each backed by rival courts and cardinals. This chaos did something unprecedented. It turned the highest religious office in Europe into a contested asset. And contested assets can be financed. Giovanni understood the asymmetry. A pope controlled legitimacy, law, and immense financial flows, but had no standing army and no independent treasury. A banker, on the other hand, had capital, liquidity, and patience. The transaction was obvious. Baldassare Cosa was the perfect candidate. Ambitious, ruthless, and politically flexible. He had proximity to power, but lacked the funds to secure it. What he needed was financing. What the Medici needed was access. The arrangement was never written, but it was clear. Medici Capital would underwrite Cosa's rise. In return, the Medici Bank would become the financial nerve center of the Vatican. This was not charity. It was venture capital, high risk, historic upside. Money moved discreetly. Cardinals were persuaded. Votes were secured. In 1410, Cosa emerged as Pope John XXIII. The church remained divided, but the deal was done. For the Medici, the return on investment was extraordinary. Control of Vatican accounts meant access to Europe's largest, most stable pool of wealth. Papal taxes, indulgences, tithes, and fees now flowed through Medici ledgers. The bank became indispensable. More importantly, the Medici gained something money alone could never buy: institutional immunity. Attacking the Medici meant disrupting the church's finances. Their power was no longer local, it was systemic. This move rewired the family's trajectory. They were no longer just bankers who served power. They were financiers who selected it. The brilliance of the strategy lay in its subtlety. Giovanni never needed a title, a mitre, or a throne. By financing the papacy, he placed the Medici behind the altar, not on it. And from there, every door in Europe began to open. Once the Medici secured control of Vatican finances, power stopped being transactional. It became systemic. The Vatican was not just a religious authority. It was the largest financial clearinghouse in Europe. Papal taxes flowed in from kingdoms across the continent. Fees for appointments, dispensations, indulgences, and legal judgments generated constant revenue. Unlike secular states, this income was transnational, insulated from borders, and justified by divine authority. By placing themselves at the center of this system, the Medici did not merely gain a client, they gained the role of central banker. Every major financial operation of the church now passed through Medici hands. Funds were collected, transferred, stored, and disbursed using Medici infrastructure. Kings, bishops, and princes could argue theology, but they could not bypass the ledger. Credit decisions quietly shaped political outcomes. Liquidity determined loyalty. This was power without banners. The Vatican did not need armies when it controlled legitimacy. And the Medici did not need armies when they controlled the Vatican's money. Together, they formed a closed loop. Belief generated revenue. Revenue reinforced authority. Authority protected belief. Crucially, this position gave the Medici visibility without exposure. They saw the financial health of states, the debts of monarchs, the ambitions of cardinals. Information became leverage. Knowing who needed money and when was often more decisive than force. This arrangement also changed risk dynamics. While other banks depended on trade cycles and merchant solvency, Vatican income was structurally resilient. Faith did not crash like markets. Even during wars and plagues, money continued to flow. The Medici portfolio now included the most recession-proof asset in Europe: organized religion. In modern terms, the Vatican functioned like a supranational central bank, setting moral policy, issuing legitimacy, and redistributing capital. The Medici were its operators. From this point on, Florence was no longer the limit of Medici ambition. Their power radiated outward through Rome into courts across Europe, embedded in the daily functioning of states that believed themselves independent. This was the decisive shift. The Medici were no longer leveraging capital to access power. They were leveraging power to stabilize and multiply capital. And once finance and legitimacy merged, the family ceased to be vulnerable in the way ordinary bankers were. They had become part of the system no one could afford to break. The most durable form of Medici power was never visible. It was deliberately absent from titles, crowns, and official offices. After securing control over capital and Vatican finance, the Medici understood a critical rule of survival in Republican Florence. Formal authority attracts resistance. Informal authority attracts dependence. So they chose not to rule openly. Cosimo de' Medici perfected this model. He held no permanent public office. He wore no crown. He issued no laws in his own name. And yet, nothing of consequence happened in Florence without his approval. Elections, council appointments, military decisions, tax policy, each was shaped quietly through credit, alliances, and obligation. This was governance by leverage, not decree. Florence's political system remained intact on paper. Councils met. Votes were cast. Republican rituals continued. But behind the scenes, the Medici controlled who could borrow, who could trade, and who could survive a financial shock. In a commercial city, access to credit was access to life. Enemies were not executed. They were ruined. Loans were delayed. Credit lines tightened. Allies were rewarded with favorable terms and protection. Rivals found themselves isolated, unable to fund campaigns or maintain influence. Power shifted without violence, leaving no martyrdom, no rebellion, no clear enemy to rally against. This indirect rule also provided insulation. When Florence faced crises, wars, revolts, economic downturns, the Medici could step back, allowing official leaders to absorb blame. Authority without accountability is the rarest form of power, and Cosimo achieved it. Exile proved the strength of the system. When Cosimo was banished in 1433, Florence did not regain stability. It lost it. Trade faltered. Alliances collapsed. Credit dried up. Within a year, the city demanded his return, not because he commanded it, but because the system could not function without him. Upon his return, Cosimo did not declare victory. He resumed invisibility. This was the genius of Medici dominance. They ruled not by commanding the state, but by becoming indispensable to it. The city could imagine life without Medici titles. It could not imagine life without Medici capital. By avoiding the appearance of rule, the Medici made their power harder to attack and easier to endure. They did not sit on the throne. They made the throne financially dependent on them. The Albizzi believed power was something you seized. The Medici understood power was something you made indispensable. Rinaldo degli Albizzi represented the old Florentine elite, families who ruled through offices, alliances, and force. When the Medici began to eclipse them economically, the Albizzi responded the only way they knew how, by using the state against a rival. In 1433, they engineered Cosimo de' Medici's arrest. Charges of treason followed. Execution was considered. Instead, Cosimo was exiled, and the Albizzi believed the problem had been solved. Remove the man, and the system collapses. They misunderstood the system. Cosimo did not rule Florence through presence. He ruled it through capital. From exile in Venice, his network continued to operate. Credit still flowed, or stopped, according to Medici interests. Trade routes shifted. Alliances weakened. Confidence evaporated. Meanwhile, the Albizzi governed openly and expensively. They financed wars they could not afford. They drained Florence's treasury to project authority. Without Medici banking discipline, fiscal strain mounted quickly. Merchants grew restless. Elites felt excluded. The broader population absorbed the cost of decisions they did not support. Fear replaced consent. This is where the Albizzi lost. Power enforced through coercion creates resistance. Power exercised through dependency creates silence. As Florence's economy faltered, the contrast became obvious. Under Medici influence, the city prospered. Under Albizzi rule, it stagnated. The issue was no longer politics, it was liquidity. Within a year, the city reversed itself. The same institutions that exiled Cosimo invited him back, not because he demanded it, because Florence needed him. When Cosimo returned in 1434, there were no purges, no executions, no declarations of revenge. He did not overthrow the Albizzi with violence. He rendered them irrelevant. Their supporters lost credit. Their influence dissolved. Their networks collapsed. Power shifted without bloodshed, leaving no dramatic rupture, only a quiet reordering of reality. This episode exposed a fundamental truth. In a commercial republic, economic control outweighs legal authority. The Albizzi had offices. The Medici had leverage. One ruled the city. The other made the city function. And in the end, Florence chose the system that kept it alive. Once political dominance was secured quietly, the Medici faced a different problem. Legitimacy, power taken by leverage, can survive. Power accepted by society can endure. Culture solved that problem. Cosimo de' Medici understood that money and credit could control Florence, but they could not inspire it. A city that believed itself ruled by bankers would eventually rebel. A city that believed itself chosen, elevated by art, learning, and beauty, would defend its patrons willingly. So, the Medici invested where resistance dissolves. Culture. Art was not decoration. It was infrastructure for consent. Architecture was not vanity. It was narrative. Each commission carried a message. Florence is prosperous, enlightened, and destined for greatness, and the Medici made it so. Donatello's David was not merely a sculpture. It was a political symbol. Youthful strength defeating giants. Republican virtue cloaked in bronze, subtly aligned with Medici guardianship. The Palazzo Medici was not a palace of excess, but one of controlled restraint, powerful without arrogance, dominant without provocation. It broadcast stability. Scholarship followed the same logic. Humanist thinkers, philosophers, and educators were funded, protected, and elevated. Florence became a center of learning not by accident, but by sponsorship. Intellectual prestige softened political reality. This cultural patronage achieved something force never could. It reframed Medici dominance as civic benefit. Prosperity appeared shared. Power appeared generous. The line between public good and private influence blurred. Importantly, this strategy also neutralized moral opposition. Critics could argue politics. They could not easily argue against beauty, learning, and civic pride. Culture became a shield, absorbing resentment before it hardened into revolt. Other families ruled Florence before the Medici. None rewrote Florence's identity. By the mid-15th century, Florence was no longer just a city-state. It was the cradle of the Renaissance, and the Medici were inseparable from that identity. To attack them was to attack the city's greatness itself. This was legitimacy at its most sophisticated, not imposed, not argued, felt. The Medici did not ask Florence to accept their power. They made Florence proud of it. And once power is woven into a city's culture, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to remove, because removing it feels like erasing what the city believes it is. Culture did not distract from Medici power. It sanctified it. Florence was still called a republic. But by the mid-15th century, its mechanics no longer behaved like one. The Medici had mastered indirect rule, credit, alliances, culture. But success introduced a new imbalance. Financial power accumulated faster than Republican institutions could absorb. What had once been influence began to resemble dominance. The problem was scale. Republican systems depend on rotation, rivalry, and limits. Medici power depended on continuity, concentration, and patience. These two logics could coexist only while the gap remained manageable. By Lorenzo de' Medici's rise, it no longer was. Lorenzo inherited not just capital and networks, but a city structurally dependent on Medici management. Trade relied on Medici credit. Politics relied on Medici mediation. Public stability relied on Medici spending. Florence could still vote, but it could no longer function independently. To preserve control, Lorenzo formalized what had previously been informal. Councils were reshaped. Key positions were filled with loyalists. In 1480, a council of 70 trusted men was established, sidelining traditional republican bodies. Elections continued, but outcomes were increasingly predetermined. This was not tyranny in appearance. There were no crowns, no declarations of monarchy. The facade of republicanism remained intact. But the substance had changed. Taxes became tools. Friends were rewarded. Rivals were weakened financially rather than eliminated physically. Public works were funded generously, not just to beautify Florence, but to maintain popular support. The city prospered, but prosperity was now conditional. This was the paradox of Medici power. The more effectively they governed it, the less necessary republican oversight became. Stability replaced participation. Results replaced process. And once citizens prioritize stability, they tolerate concentration. The system no longer corrected itself. Opposition existed, but lacked leverage. Credit was centralized. Cultural prestige aligned with Medici rule. Even resentment struggled to organize without financial oxygen. Florence had not voted itself into submission. It had drifted there, one dependency at a time. By the end of Lorenzo's rule, the Republic still existed in name, but not in balance. Power was no longer contested meaningfully. It was managed. This was the moment when Medici financial authority crossed a critical threshold. It no longer needed to negotiate with the Republic. It simply outweighed it. And when financial power outgrows political structure, collapse does not come immediately. It waits for a shock strong enough to expose what the system can no longer contain. When the Medici placed one of their own on the papal throne, power crossed a decisive boundary. Finance no longer supported religion. Religion began amplifying finance. Giovanni de' Medici's election as Pope Leo III in 1513 was not a spiritual culmination. It was a structural escalation. For the first time, the family controlled not just the church's accounts, but the institution's authority to legitimize rulers, wars, and wealth itself. The papacy was the ultimate multiplier. As Pope, Leo X commanded a transnational system of obedience. Kings might resist armies. They could not easily resist excommunication. Bishops, princes, and city-states all depended on papal approval for legal standing, marriages, titles, and territorial claims. This made the church an enforcement mechanism without soldiers. And the Medici were now at the controls. Financially, the implications were enormous. Papal revenues flowed through systems shaped by Medici interests. Appointments, dispensations, indulgences, and church offices generated income on a continental scale. Capital extraction was no longer limited by geography or trade. It was anchored in belief. But leverage cuts both ways. Leo Staggs treated the papacy as a stage for Medici grandeur. Lavish festivals, artistic commissions, and the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica drained the Vatican treasury. To compensate, indulgences were expanded aggressively, turning salvation into a financial product. This was a short-term revenue strategy with catastrophic long-term cost. The overselling of indulgences exposed the Church's financial machinery to public scrutiny. What had once been abstract faith became visible transaction. Martin Luther's protest did not attack theology alone. It attacked the monetization of legitimacy. The result was systemic fracture. The Protestant Reformation stripped the papacy of moral monopoly across Northern Europe. Authority fragmented. Revenue streams collapsed. The very institution the Medici used as leverage became unstable. When Giulio de' Medici ascended as Pope Clement VII, the risk intensified. Caught between rival empires, Clement miscalculated alliances. The sack of Rome in 1527 shattered the illusion of papal invulnerability. Religious authority could now be violated by force. This was the cost of overextension. The Medici had proven that religion could be weaponized as financial and political leverage. But they also demonstrated the danger of relying too heavily on a system whose legitimacy depends on belief. Once belief breaks, leverage evaporates. And from that point on, Medici power would have to evolve again, or collapse with the institution it had mastered. The Medici had mastered finance, culture, and religion. But in 1527, they collided with a force those tools could not neutralize: imperial violence. Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici, inherited a Europe no longer governed by belief alone. Power had shifted toward centralized monarchies and professional armies. At the center stood Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, wealthier, better armed, and less restrained by doctrine than any ruler before him. Clement faced a dilemma the Medici system was not built for: align with Charles V and become subordinate to imperial power, or resist and preserve papal independence. He chose resistance, forming the League of Cognac with France and Italian states. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Charles V responded not with diplomacy, but with force. In May 1527, an unpaid, undisciplined imperial army, fueled by hunger, resentment, and religious fury, marched on Rome. The city, poorly defended and politically isolated, fell almost immediately. What followed was not conquest, it was collapse. For months, Rome was looted, burned, and desecrated. Churches were stripped, art destroyed, clergy murdered. The Vatican's aura of divine protection evaporated in blood and smoke. Clement VII escaped only by fleeing through a secret passage into Castel Sant'Angelo, besieged while his capital was dismantled below. This was more than a military disaster. It was a systemic failure. The Medici strategy depended on the papacy's moral supremacy. The sack of Rome proved that supremacy was no longer absolute. Armies could ignore excommunication. Soldiers could sack God's city without consequence. Religious leverage had lost its enforcement power. Financially, the damage was immense. Vatican revenues collapsed. Credit dried up. The Church's authority fractured further, accelerating the decline begun by the Reformation. The Medici, whose power was embedded in papal stability, suddenly found their core pillar exposed. This moment marked the end of an era. The Medici had bet on legitimacy as an untouchable shield. They discovered too late that legitimacy without force is fragile when confronted by empire. From this point forward, power would no longer belong to those who controlled belief. It would belong to those who controlled armies. And the Medici system, brilliant, patient, and subtle, was no longer sufficient on its own. The sack of Rome exposed a brutal truth the Medici could no longer ignore. Power based on finance and legitimacy collapses when confronted by organized force. If the family was to survive, it had to evolve again. Cosimo de' Medici was that evolution, chosen in 1537 precisely because he seemed weak, young, and controllable. Cosimo inherited a Florence exhausted by chaos and factional violence. The elites believed they were appointing a placeholder. Instead, they installed a ruler who understood the lesson his predecessors had learned too late. Indirect power was no longer enough. Cosimo moved with speed and clarity. Republican remnants were dismantled. Opposition was not negotiated with. It was eliminated. Conspiracies were crushed early, publicly, and decisively. Exile and execution replaced credit pressure as tools of control. Fear returned to Florentine politics, but this time it was centralized. Most importantly, Cosimo built what the earlier Medici had avoided: a standing military. Loyal troops replaced mercenary dependence. Fortifications were strengthened. Military command answered directly to him. For the first time, Medici authority was enforceable without intermediaries. Finance still mattered, but it now funded force rather than replacing it. This shift unlocked expansion. With backing from the Spanish crown, Cosimo turned outward. Siena, a rival city-state, was besieged and starved into submission in 1555. Its fall marked the end of Florentine vulnerability. Tuscany was no longer a loose network of influence. It was territory under control. In 1569, Cosimo secured papal recognition as Grand Duke of Tuscany. This title was not ceremonial. It marked a structural transformation. The Medici were no longer bankers behind the state or patrons beside it. They were the state. The genius of Cosimo. I was not abandoning Medici tradition, but completing it. He fused finance, legitimacy, and force into a single system. Banking funded armies. Religion validated titles. Military power enforced order. Shadow power had become sovereign power. This transition came at a cost. The flexibility and invisibility of earlier Medici rule was gone. Power was now visible and therefore brittle in new ways, but it was also absolute. Cosimo understood the new rules of Europe. Empires did not negotiate with bankers. They recognized rulers who could defend borders. The Medici adapted, and in doing so, they ensured that their power would no longer depend on permission, only on strength. Catherine de' Medici represented the final export of the Medici system, power detached from Florence and embedded inside a foreign crown. She did not arrive in France as a conqueror. She arrived as a bargaining chip. Married at 14 to Prince Henry of France, Catherine entered the court with no army, no faction, and no affection from her husband. For years, she was sidelined, overshadowed by royal mistresses, and dismissed by nobles who saw her as an Italian outsider. But Catherine had been trained in a Medici world where survival depended on patience, observation, and leverage, not status. She waited. When Henry II died suddenly in 1559, France was left with a child king and a fractured realm. Catherine moved immediately. As regent for her young sons, she stepped into the vacuum and did what the Medici had always done best: stabilize power by managing competing forces rather than eliminating them outright. France at the time was not one kingdom. It was a fault line. Catholic nobles, Protestant Huguenots, regional warlords, and foreign powers all pressed inward. Catherine understood that outright dominance was impossible. Balance was the strategy. She financed peace when possible. She negotiated alliances when necessary. And when neither worked, she allowed violence to burn itself out in controlled ways. Power, to Catherine, was not moral. It was managerial. But balance has limits. As religious conflict intensified, Catherine faced the same dilemma her family had faced in Rome decades earlier. Legitimacy without force collapses under pressure. In 1572, she chose decisively. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not chaos. It was a calculated assertion of control. Thousands died, and France recoiled in horror. The move secured short-term authority and long-term infamy. Catherine's reign did not create a stable dynasty. It created endurance. She kept the Valois crown alive through decades of civil war, intrigue, and assassination. That alone was an achievement in an age where kingdoms vanished overnight. This was Medici power in its most distant form. No banks, no papacy, no Florence. Just a woman applying the same cold logic to a larger, bloodier stage. Catherine did not rule France because she was loved. She ruled because she understood systems better than anyone else in the room. And for a time, that was enough to keep a kingdom from tearing itself apart. The Medici did not collapse in defeat. They aged out of relevance. Their system was brilliant for its time. Capital converted into legitimacy. Legitimacy converted into control, and control stabilized through culture. For nearly 3 centuries, this formula allowed a banking family to rule cities, command the church, and place blood on foreign thrones. But history changed its rules. Power migrated away from networks and toward nation-states. Armies replaced credit as the final arbiter. Bureaucracy replaced patronage. Legitimacy no longer flowed from the church alone, but from borders, taxes, and permanent force. The Medici system, built for flexibility and influence, struggled in a world that rewarded scale and centralization. Their later rulers inherited titles, but not mechanisms. Wealth without leverage. Prestige without fear. As Europe hardened into modern states, Medici power became ceremonial, visible, but no longer decisive. They did not fail at ruling. They failed to adapt faster than the system itself evolved, and yet their legacy remains unmatched. The Medici proved that power is not seized only by swords or crowns, but engineered through finance, institutions, narrative, and timing. They understood centuries early that the most effective rulers are those who shape the systems others must operate within. When the last Medici died in 1737, Florence passed quietly into foreign hands. There was no uprising, no collapse, just a transfer, because the family that once rewired Europe no longer controlled the circuits of power. The Medici are remembered not because they ruled longest, but because they ruled differently. They didn't just play the game of history. They redesigned it and forced the world to play by new rules long after they were gone.